It's my pleasure today to welcome Philip Smith to the series. Philip is, and I can just consult my notes here, a little bit of background on Philip, professional background that is I don't know very much about your personal background, Philip. Has his PhD in psychology, clinical and development, and his MA from the University of Western Ontario, BA in psychology from the University of Texas at Dallas. As some of you are aware, Philip is one of our 3M National Teaching Fellows, and that was awarded in 2003. And he's also the Canadian University Professor of the Year from the Council of the Advancement and Support of Education, and that was awarded in 2000. In terms of Philip's academic appointments, he's been on the island at UPEI since 1988 and has been a full professor in the Department of Psychology since 2005, and is currently the chair of the department and also served in that capacity in the early 1990s. He's also served as a stint as the Dean of Arts from 96 to 2002, and on the side runs a clinical psychology practice, part-time I noticed in your CV, and has done that since 1989. And I should say that as with Shannon, our first speaker in the series, and I think you'll see that this is a consistent trend as we go through the series, Philip has also demonstrated his commitment to student engagement in many ways other than just a talk like this and other than his 3M. He's published in the area of pedagogy and scholarship, and so he's incorporating his teaching into his scholarship. And in addition to that, he has played a role mentoring others through presentations and other public, public demonstrations of the scholarship of teaching in a number of different areas. Just to give you an example, he wrote an article on writing in a large class, stronger motivation, better writing, and he's given 12 presentations on various aspects of teaching and pedagogy, including the topics of teaching large classes, explaining the relevance and application, I think, of good theory, and using clickers to foster student engagement and interaction. And the title of the topic that Philip has chosen today is called, as you can see from the slide up here, do we still call them slides? Is Claim Their Time, Engaging Students in Academic Effort Outside the Classroom. So, Philip, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Jim. And thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jim, for organizing this series in student engagement. I think it's important to have administrative leaders on campus share the message that these kinds of issues are important for consideration, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I do have, for anybody who's interested, before you head out today, if you'd like a copy of the slides, those can be picked up at the end. So if there's something really profound on there, don't feel a need to write it all down. You can take that home with you, and don't need to worry about taking notes otherwise, unless that's a helpful way for you to process information as we go along. There's a special way of handling this clicker that Jay taught me. If I click on the reverse side, it goes ahead. So otherwise, it does what I just did. There are a couple of things that I want to mention before we get started in case this isn't clear as we go on, or if I forget to mention them later. I really like students, and I really like teaching, and I am optimistic about the whole thing. Okay? Now, later on, I might sound a little whiny, and I don't want you to think that that's the main emphasis. So remember this slide, please, if it doesn't come across later on. Also, I recognize that student learning is very complex, and this matter of how much time students spend on studying and working on learning is an important part, but only one part of the complex process of learning. A couple of brief stories. I think 5 years ago, I was teaching a class in statistics in psychology, Psychology 271, Statistics for the Behavioral Sciences. This is a required course for anybody who wants to be a psychology major, and we also have nursing students take it as their required stats course. This is not top of mind when students decide they want to major in psychology. This is a course that many students, not all, but many students fear. They're nervous about taking a course in statistics. They have memories of not doing well in math when they were in school before. I have had every semester somebody mention to me that they can't do math and their mother couldn't do math, and nobody in their family is ever going to be able to do math. It's a genetically determined flaw of some sort. So this is a course where you would think students would come in, for the most part, saying, well, you know, I really had to kind of buckle down and get at it to get through this course. I had students keep a study log. They could get 1 bonus point, okay, a single point, if they kept a study log for the semester, a bare bones study log, which was just, I gave them a sheet of paper with every day between the first day of class and the final day of class as a row, and if they went to class on a class day, they just made a check mark. If they went to lab, they made a check mark. And if they studied for the course, they would fill in how much time they spent studying. They would hand this in at the end of the semester, but also midway in the semester, or a little bit before midway. I think it was due the first week of October. I remember seeing when one of the when these study logs came in, one student who had her name on the top, but the first page was blank. I thought, oh, well, that's curious. But when I turned over the page, there was an entry for October 2nd, and this student had gone beyond the requirements of the assignment. She had made a little note to me. On October 2nd, there was filled in for time studied, 25 minutes, and the little note, we have our first exam next week. I thought I would get a head start. Okay. Now, this wasn't attached to a little smiley face that was a little joke or something like that. This student sincerely believed that what was feasible and appropriate in this course was to do absolutely nothing in the course other than go to class. And I think she maybe attended every class. She regularly attended class. But to do nothing outside of class until it was time to get ready for the first test. So that struck me as peculiar, especially given that this was a class that has a reputation as being a harder class. Last fall, I had lunch. My introductory psychology students get an invitation to come to lunch one day. The university pays for the lunch, and we have a group of anywhere from a few to 7 or 8 students at lunch. And one day, again in October, had lunch with some students, and one of the students, and we don't always talk about psychology, but sometimes we do, one of the students mentioned, and there were several other students there, but he mentioned that things hadn't been going very well for him on the quizzes in the class, and that, in fact, it looked like he wasn't passing the course, and I'd known this, had sort of looked things up about the students before they came, and so I was glad that he raised that. And his comment to me was, and I wrote it down when I got back to class, probably I should try reading the chapter. Okay. Now, again, this was a student who was not at the maximum end of disengaged. This student signed up to come to lunch with a professor, okay, and showed up, okay? And so he was not somebody who just was disengaged from everything. But despite the fact that we had spent multiple times in class talking about study strategies and so on, for this student, the idea that, well, maybe it would be a good idea for me to read the chapter was an insight in October. Oh, there I go again, Jay. This is going backwards. Now, I expect you already know that spending time on task is one of the most powerful predictors of learning. Okay? Again, you can waste time preparing and studying, but if you look at all sorts of predictors of learning, time on task is a huge predictor. And this is really robust through learning of all kinds of higher education kind of material, learning in high schools, learning in elementary schools, learning motor tasks that have nothing to do with cognition, and even crosses species. Okay, time on task is a really powerful predictor of learning. Barbara Woolford, who's emeritus from Notre Dame, has said that it's really important that students come to understand the basic principle is you can't be educated if you don't spend time. Now, she's not saying this spending time is a sufficient condition for being educated, but she is saying it's a necessary one. So, how much time do students spend on academic tasks outside of class? So this is what I, for some reason, wrote in my syllabus this year. I think it's been cut and paste from syllabi over the year. But in my statistics and research design class for January, you'll find this quote. The rule of thumb most faculty have for study time is 2 to 3 hours per week of study time for every 1 hour of class time. That is to say, 6 to 9 hours per week of study time in this course. Even if you have not found that rule of thumb has applied in your early courses, you're likely to find it does in this course. And what I would say in class and always have is, well, let's take the lower limit, because really probably there's not a lot of the 3 hours per class time. Now, I break a rule that I make for my students. I don't have any reference there, any citation. I don't know where I got this notion that that was our rule of thumb. I think it was, like most of the things we do in teaching, that's what I heard when I was going to school, and so that's what I carried on. I don't know if that has any resonance for anybody else, if you've heard that kind of thing or not. Yeah, okay. Okay, well, good, thank you. So, reality check on that. And one of the things that we can do is look to some actual UPEI data from the NSSE survey that was conducted in 2008. And there's a category there that asks students to indicate how many hours they spend on preparing for class in a typical 7-day week. And you'll see that it's a comprehensive list of things they might do. Okay? So it's studying, it's writing, it's reading, it's rehearsing, it's lab work, and so on. And they check off one of these boxes about how much time they spend. Now, my fantasy, is that if you're taking 5 courses and you're spending at the low end 2 hours of study time for each 3-semester hour course, you'd be studying 30 plus hours a week, and your 5 courses, 15 hours, that's 45 hours a week. That's a full-time job plus a couple of evenings a week. The other 5 evenings free and weekends off. I mean, that seemed to me like that's a pretty good deal. And if you were struggling, you'd go higher than that. Now, when we look at the NSSE data for UPEI, one of the things to consider is actually the mean course load is somewhat less than 5. I think it's 4.4 or 4.6. So we give a little bit on that end. But it's also perhaps the case that students who actually fill out NSSE maybe are a little bit more engaged to start with. There's very likely a positive shift in memory. That is, we have very high likelihood of remembering having worked harder and succeeded more than we actually do. So maybe it balances out there. You'll notice, perhaps, that my fantasy at the 30 hours plus per week is in the same category as infinity. Okay? So that would be a first clue that somebody's figured out maybe that's not a highly checked off box. So for 409 first-year students at UPEI, we find that there are 20% who study 5 hours a week or less, another quarter who study 6 to 10, another quarter there. You find that there are only 13% of students at UPEI in first year who study 20 hours a week or more than 20 hours a week. Only 4% in my fantasy category. Okay. That's a lot of little time spent studying compared to what we might think is appropriate. How do we do on that bar compared to the Atlantic region in Canada? Well, not great. If you look down at the red bar, which is the proportion of students who spend more than 20 hours a week studying, we're lower there than in Atlantic Canada and Canada as a whole. A little bit higher in the low end of studying, but that's a concern. But it's not like in the rest of Canada, they're all busily scurrying away in the library all hours either. So presumably fourth-year students study more Okay, they're a more select group, and they're more engaged in things, and they do. But again, we have 36% of fourth-year students studying 10 hours or less a week. And then when we get up to the more than 20 hours a week, it's a quarter of them studying that amount. Again, not very large numbers for our fourth-year students either. We're not alone in this. There's a book published just last month that some of you may have heard about, Academically Adrift: Limited Learning on College Campuses. Now, you start off with a little bit of caution because every few years somebody writes a book about the end of higher education in the Western world and so on, and that sells lots of copies and so on. I bought this book, and it is an interesting read. They followed large sample of students from representative group of colleges and universities in the US. 12.15 hours a week is the mean amount of studying done there. So that's very, very close to what we see in the UPEI data. And this is just as an aside for that study. They also report work from a measure of student learning, the collegiate learning assessment, which involves 3 tasks. 2 are analytical writing tasks around making and breaking an argument. There's another task that's a performance task where students are given a whole set of data, articles, media reports, and so on, and they have to do something. They have to synthesize and analyze that data, such as in preparing a memo about that talks about which data support or refute some kind of claim and what kind of recommendation people would make. So it's designed to get at critical thinking and analytical reasoning, problem solving and writing. It does not do anything to measure content-specific knowledge about psychology content or mathematics content or English content. So it's these broader competencies, not knowledge specific to a discipline. By that measure, almost half of the students didn't show any evidence of learning in the first 2 years of college, and a third showed no evidence of learning over all 4 years. Again, of the competencies measured by this instrument. Now, those competencies are pretty important ones. So those are the kinds of competencies that we say set us apart from colleges and trade schools and so on. We say this is what makes, these are the main kinds of skills that you're going to bring with you in addition to your content knowledge with your BA or BSc or other undergraduate degree. Anyhow, that's an aside. And they did demonstrate that, as you might expect, the lower the amount of study time, the lower the scores on these kinds of assessments. The lower the faculty demands on students, the lower the scores on those kinds of assessments. Now, it's tempting, again, a talk like this really easy to say, well, it ain't the way it used to be, okay? And people have been making those kinds of claims since ancient times about our wayward youth and so on. However, there's actually evidence that study time has decreased a lot over decades. There's some good data from US labor statistics on time usage that show we get a decrease from about 25 hours in the early 60s to the 13 or so hours that we see just about now. Okay, so people are, on average, studying less than used to be the case. So what do we do about that? One of the possibilities is to spend some time as individual faculty thinking about the learning that we want from our students and asking questions about what best happens inside the classroom and what best can happen outside of the classroom. Now, Walvoord has come up with I think a really straightforward but useful topology of the learning process where she talks about the importance of distinguishing between first exposure, that is where the student first hears or reads or views new information or new kinds of concepts, and the processing that gets done. And that it's also, of course, important to distinguish between more surface kind of processing and deeper kind of processing. So if somebody's spending their processing time memorizing lists and memorizing definitions, that's processing, but it's not the kind of deep processing that's involved in working at synthesis, at evaluation, at application. And of course, we also had to pay attention to the kind of feedback, the kind of responding that happens, and the notion of feedback that comes from faculty, but other people potentially as well. And what Wolford has suggested is that it can make sense to rethink how we structure student and faculty time in class, student time out of class, and faculty time in and out of class. So, traditionally, even though we might say, read the chapter before coming to class, really, first exposure ends up being mostly in the classroom for lots of courses, lots of classes. We expect students then to go home and process that because we've used up all of the classroom time telling them about material, summarizing material. They go home and process it either by studying or writing the work, or they go home and don't process it if we look at the data on study time. Okay? And most of the response that gets provided is provided by faculty, and that happens on the weekends when faculty are marking the papers and doing other kind of work. So are there some alternatives to that? And are there some possibilities of moving that first exposure outside of class time so that it's possible within class time for students to be engaged, perhaps with faculty present, in processing the information? So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just take a couple of minutes with one or two people who are nearby you to think about things you might already be doing or that you could imagine being doing to increase the likelihood that students would come to class already having had first exposure to the material that's being dealt with in class that day. How do we maximize the chance of that actually happening? So just somebody nearby for just a couple of minutes. We'll see what kinds of things are already happening. Okay. So if we could come back as a group and maybe hear 3 or 4 ideas of things people are already doing or could imagine doing to maximize that kind of shift or have heard of others doing. Who could start us off? Thanks, Kathy.
How about posting the lecture ahead of time through Moodle so it can be viewed so that when you get to the class, then the first exposure has already sort of been undertaken. You're still relaying the message and you're lecturing, but it's just a different frame. It focuses then on reflection and processing in the class. So.
Okay, neat idea. Is there anybody who's doing that yet? Vicky, do you do that some? Okay.
Students do in developmental or child development co-curricular activities, and they're all activities outside of class and kind of parallel with what we're talking about. So I hook them in with points on a post like a critical thinking activity or a case study or something really neat that they have to respond to on Moodle. And what happens is because it's so neat, the critical thinking question or the case study, they have to read the material before they can respond to it. Because the response has to be well done. And so they're all buzzing before they even get in to the lecture on Moodle. So I'm following that and cheering them on. And so we sort of do like a pre and post piece as well.
Okay, so another kind of strategy to engage students in some dialogue with each other through Moodle. The possibility of, so if as a professor, my sense is, look, there's no book been written yet that can communicate as well as I can the information that needs to get across here. One possibility is to sit in front of the Skype or whatever and say it, okay? And probably you don't have to do that every semester. I mean, the world isn't changing that quickly. And if it is, then more power to you. You can say it every semester. And you've got that in the can, and maybe for a couple of years or so, that can be the lecture that's available, and the students have heard it directly from you, and they can then come into class to do something. That would be a possibility. Other kinds of possibilities. Yeah.
One thing I'm doing in 4th year class that's working quite well is the students are doing reading memos so that they have assigned readings for the week and they have to send me a short memo, no more than 1.5 pages, where they say the main point, what their reflection is on the main point, and some key questions that it raises. And so that I find that then they become really engaged with material, and it helps me to see what they're already thinking about it beforehand. But I'm not sure how do you adapt that for a large number of students in the introductory level.
Okay, but that notion of really providing a structure where the only way that somebody comes to class is to have been prepared to engage and buzz with people about what's going on, because they've already done some thinking about, they've read and they've done some thinking and even a little bit of writing about what's going on. Okay, yeah.
We were just talking, Trina and I are in a NDE class together, and Sean Lee, our professor, does this thing where every week he assigns 3 or 4 readings, and you don't have to read them all, but usually you read at least 2 and hopefully 3 of them. And then you choose one, and then we actually have a communal slideshow. So it's on Google Docs, so it's just like a PowerPoint. So everyone has to make a slide in response to something they've read. And it's all kinds of things. Sometimes it's just people write something, or they pull out a quotation that they like and they talk about it. Sometimes people draw pictures, write a poem, there's all kinds of stuff. And then we comment on each other's slides. So that's part of the assignment. So you have to put up a slide. You have to comment on two other people's slides. When people comment, do more than that. So if you don't do your homework, other people can't, right? So by the time you get to class, the conversation's already well underway. And it's 16 people, and it's a graduate level course. But I think you could do something with a larger class.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about a similar kind of approach with an undergraduate, but still a seminar course. Now, part of me thought, well, why spend time dealing with a seminar course, which is kind of like the ideal situation when we're talking about learning. But remember back to what our fourth-year students are not doing outside of class, and I think it makes sense to think about what can be happening with upper level, sometimes smaller courses. This idea came out of the Teaching Professor newsletter a couple of years ago, and Shannon, you might have done. I think you said you did something like this, where every student presents every class in this seminar. So we did this last winter with a special topics course in family violence. There were 14 students in the course, so third or fourth year students, small class, pretty ideal. But still, have you ever been to a seminar where you come to the seminar and it seems like maybe not everybody's carefully thought about the readings? I sure have, okay? So in this seminar, we met once a week. There was a core topic each week. Everybody presented every week. We would have 7 or 8 students who would do a 1-minute presentation, okay, on something about the topic that a person wouldn't know from having done the readings. And I literally brought a bell with me, so the bell rang at 60 seconds, and you had 10 seconds to wrap up if you weren't done, okay? 2 or 3 people did a 5-minute presentation each week, and that would be on some empirical article on the topic. And 2 or 3 people did a 15-minute presentation each week that was on one of the assigned readings that everybody had done for class. And part of making sure that everybody had done it relates to ideas that have come up. People would post a couple of open-ended questions on the Moodle site a few days before class, and in fact, the presentation had to incorporate responses to at least the bulk of those questions that were raised. And this counted lots in the course grade. Okay? What counts in course grades does have an influence on student behavior. So 50% of the course grade was on presentations, and 25% was on thoughtful participation. I almost never do participation kinds of grades for a set of reasons, but here was a situation where students really were well prepared, could be well prepared if they were in the game, to make thoughtful contributions to what was going on, because they had done some outside reading, they'd thought about the assigned readings. There was no reason not to expect that they could make thoughtful contributions. I was flying high every week after this class. I'm exaggerating a little bit. There were 1 or 2 students who didn't get with the program as much as you'd like, but even they, I know, learned a lot more than they otherwise would have. And my role there was, I kept occasionally saying, okay, what do I do to earn my salary this week? Because they were so engaged in a thoughtful, meaningful kind of way. And there were times where I could come in with some additional kind of information or help to ask some guiding questions. But the engagement was, I think, much more than people saying, okay, what do I have to do to get my 25% here? There was really meaningful, thoughtful engagement. So this has a lot to do with restructuring what happens outside of class. So there was no first presentation. Well, I suppose, well, that's not true. There was first presentation by students to other students in those 1 and 5 minute presentations, but they were on material related to things students had already read and thought about. Okay, so they were able to make meaningful contributions. Here's another possibility that we're working with larger classes, and this is a mechanism called interteaching that I've been using for 3 years now with statistics and research design courses. So this is a 2-course sequence that students work through. There are like 50 to 60 students in the class. And Jason Duran from psychology has also started using interteaching this year in the other section of stats and research design. The process is like this. We work with a chapter a week from a text, and we heavily rely on the text. We do lots of work with the text material. And as a faculty member, I prepare a guide to that material each week. Now, again, this is the first time in my life I've ever prepared guides. I've been thinking, why should I be preparing guides for people that should teach them to learn to read the material themselves? Well, part of it is they're really genuinely scared, whatever, some of them, of this statistics stuff, even though it's not hard math, or it's very basic kind of math, but there's a lot of fear there, which gets in their way of being able to manage that material. So there'd be a study guide of maybe 18, 24 questions on a chapter. That would be questions that would ask students to really work with the concepts. They would be saying, compare this concept with that one, come up with an example of this, suppose you were doing this kind of study. So a lot of application, assessment, more analytical kinds of questions, and a few straightforward ones like, how would you explain this term to somebody else? And the assignment is, you work with this material until you're prepared to teach it to your partner next class. So that's the level of familiarity that you're to have with the material. When we come to class, students work in pairs. Each student has prepared the full study, the full preparation guide, and you sit down with your partner and you go through question by question and you teach one another the material. Okay? And I circulate some. I have not got this circulating stuff down pat, my whole career. I don't know, I don't want to intrude, but I want to be available. But anyhow, I circulate some, and students will call me over if they have some kind of question. And we spend about half of the class time in that mode of interteaching.
So do they always work with the same partner?
In my class, you're allowed to work with the same partner for up to 3 consecutive weeks, after which you need to make a switch. And then you can come back to your old partner if you want. My rationale is that I don't want somebody, I don't want somebody to feel that they're stuck with somebody who doesn't pull their weight. Okay, so you can change partners whenever you want. But I also don't want people to get too reliant on just the same familiar face. So we mix it up a bit. But you could imagine reasonable people could disagree on that kind of approach.
Philip,
Yeah.
So does each partner prepare the same thing?
Yes. Yeah, so they take turns. So one of the things I say, okay, so let's suppose somebody has just explained something to you, and it's pretty much the way that you would have explained it. Probably you don't need to take as much time explaining it back, but you still go through the main points, okay, and get that experience.
What do you do when partners don't show up?
Oh, you just at the beginning of class, you say, find a partner. Okay, you're just partners in the class time. You're not partners outside of class. So, and if we have an odd number of people that day, then there's a group of 3. Yeah.
I have a question too, and I suppose liking because there's a lot of questions about it. But I do some sort of a rendition of that. But how do you get through all of the material this way? You know, I mean, you can't do this every class and say to take a chapter. Well, in my case, I'm taking one specific chapter out of a textbook that has a specialty in it, and I just want them to do that one. But how do you get through, 15 chapters of material that way?
Okay. I do it every class.
Do you?
Yeah, and let me tell you how. Okay, it's because it's really important, I think. One of the things that I have in mind is that I don't have to say it in order for the students to get through it. Okay, so that's not a requirement. The students have to work through it, and how can that happen? So the students do this for about half of the class, and then. So I'm doing this in a 3-hour class. If I was doing it twice a week, they'd do it for the whole class, and then we'd move on in the second class of the week to part 2. At the end of their interteaching, they fill out a record that asks a bunch of questions, including things like how much time did you spend preparing, what questions did you find easiest, and what items in the preparation guide remain unclear to you. Okay. And then at the break, they go away for 15 minutes, and I then go through all of the record sheets, and I just do a check and count up which are the questions that are the ones that are proving problematic for students. And that's what I then make a presentation about. And I do not waste their time and mine doing a presentation on something that people already know about. Okay? That's what we talk about for the other half of the class. So part of what I'm able to do is I'm able to avoid my doing a presentation on material that students already understand. Now, of course, in a set of 24 questions, you won't have very many questions that nobody has said, I'd like more time spent on this. And so there's always an invitation, please come and see me at the end of class, or come see me in my office if we didn't go over something that was a concern to you. But this is the way that we shift up the break in time. Okay, so as a professor, you need to be prepared to talk about whatever might come up as problematic, and it's sometimes hard to predict. I'm not great at predicting what's going to be problematic. I'm good at it, but I'm not great at it. So you had to be prepared to go over any of the material there. But what happens when you're doing this is a few things. One, students have multiple chances of learning here. Their main chance of learning comes from the preparation that they're doing at home. And the fact that they know that they have the focus of, I need to be prepared to teach this to my partner. They have some, not threatening, but some pressure, okay, to be with it, okay, to be able to teach this to somebody else. So that kind of preparation, that kind of focus, gets a focus on what's most important here. What are the main concepts? What example can I come up with to illustrate this? So that's a teaching opportunity. A learning opportunity. Another learning opportunity happens in class, where they get to say that to somebody else and find out when the puzzled looks are coming and when they aren't. And they also have an opportunity to hear from somebody else, the other person's version of that material. Then they have another opportunity in class to hear from me. So for example, if two people have come up with different kinds of responses to something, that would be a clue to say, hey, please talk about this. Or if people have said, look, I worked with this and I don't understand what this is about at all, then they have another opportunity to learn with me. And part of interteaching also is, and this isn't a big part of it, and we could spend a few hours debating the merits of this, but a proposed part that I've been using is the assignment of quality points. So there are a few points in my course. It's 10% of your course grade is based on quality points, and the quality points are related to your performance and your partner's performance on quiz items that are taken from the interteaching guides. So if you and your partner both get an A response, like an 80% response on those quiz items, you earn full quality points. If only you get them, then you earn just half of the quality points. So it is the case that the main learning opportunity here really is not dependent upon my partner being particularly well prepared. In fact, if Jim and I are partners and Jim slacked off and isn't particularly well prepared, when we're working together, I have this wonderful opportunity to really try to help him understand that material, which is going to be, I expect, at least as beneficial for my learning as listening to him say what he's learned in his preparation. So that's an interteaching possibility. This one has been, there have been a series of studies done over the last 5 years looking at truly experimental designs where students are taking courses with interteaching versus not with interteaching. Interteaching wins every time, okay, in all of the work that's been done so far. And it's one that's pretty well received by students. Well, it's overwhelmingly positively received by students, but some students, the students who don't like it really hate it. Okay, but they're a small minority, but we hear them out. And
do you have a quiz every week? Or how do you assign the quality points? Something about a quiz.
We have a quiz. I don't have a quiz every week. I have a quiz every couple of chapters. Yeah, every couple of weeks there's a quiz. And by the way, frequent quizzing actually is one of the things in the literature that's identified as a way of increasing time on task outside of class. Okay, it just makes a difference. Sometimes not in the most, you don't get the most excited about it, but the reality is that if people are going to cram, why not have, rather than cramming for one midterm, if they cram for 8 quizzes, that's going to make a difference in their time on task. Now, so that's another possibility. Now, the thing is that it is not, when we're talking about time on task outside of class, it's not a matter of just assigning more for the sake of assigning more. Like we could go out and say, read 60 pages and write 10 pages every week, and look, I'm doing on time on task. And if that's not thoughtful and it's not connected up with what we're actually happening in the class, then that's going to be a waste of time. The work has to be meaningful, and we really need to attend to the difference between work which is busy work, surface kind of work, and work which is engaging students in thinking about concepts and application and some synthesis as appropriate to their level of engagement in the discipline. So one kind of question is, how is it even possible, though, for students to imagine that you don't have to spend quite a bit of time on task? Because, why isn't it obvious that you do? So here's the one line in my slides that I am, if I'm remembering the line right, okay, that I'm really uncomfortable with, okay. You can do just fine, Jack, without doing much work in terms of scoring grades and going on to graduate. Like, we can't say to students, if you don't work hard, you'll never get through UPEI, because they don't have to work that hard. This is the part that I'm uncomfortable with, because remember my first slide? I'm really positive about students, and I'm optimistic, and there's lots of variability, and there are some students who my concern is they're working way too hard, okay, and on and on and on. So there's lots of variability. But okay, the data suggests this is true. Just remember, we said every few years there's a book that comes out about the end of higher education, and every few years somebody will say, what's happening right now in our culture is changing the world entirely, okay? And so here's one that comes up, but I think there's something to this one. There is this myth out there that the millennials are really good at multitasking. BS. Okay? Not true. It's a myth. It's a lie. The species does not change that quickly. We don't evolve that quickly that we're able to suddenly deal with doing multiple cognitively demanding things at once. People are getting people are getting accustomed to serial tasking, moving from one thing to another, okay, and back again, and back again, and back again. The texting kind of stuff would be an example. Now, this is But to the extent that we think, oh, you can do all of these things at once, then we run into this trouble that the time spent on tasks that we're getting reported is actually a gross exaggeration of actual time spent on academic tasks. Because if I'm saying, well, I studied for an hour, but I know that there were multiple interruptions with texting and so on, then we have some difficulty. So I think this is something a bit different, okay? I mean, people have always been, I'm sure 30 years ago, oh, you know, the advent of or not 30 years ago, but the advent of television, yeah, okay, a bunch of years ago, the advent of television is the end of studying and all that, yeah. But I think it's getting more demanding as an issue. I just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce this notion of mindsets. Carol Dweck is a psychologist who's suggested that it can be really helpful to distinguish between what she calls our entity theory of self or an incremental theory of self. That is, she suggests that we have ideas about what makes us tick and who we are and how we operate. And sometimes those ideas suggest what she calls a fixed or an entity theory, and sometimes those ideas are consistent with what she calls an incremental or a growth theory. So if I'm an entity theorist, I tend to say that I tend to have very fixed and global judgments about my abilities. And if I'm an incremental theorist, I have more malleable judgments. So I'm really smart about school kind of stuff versus, well, I'm not great at this kind of school kind of stuff right now, but maybe that could change. Okay. Effort is a sign of low ability, because if my abilities are fixed, if I'm born that way, or because of my my first 3 months or 3 years I've become that way, then if I have to work hard at something, it must be because I'm not very good at it. I have low ability. In contrast to effort is what you do if you want to accomplish something. Entity theorists tend to be very attuned to how did I score on something. Incremental theorists more focused on the feedback about what I could do differently. Okay, this is a little bit of the difference between the students who have to spend all of that time writing all of those comments on the essay, the ones who only look to the back to see the score, versus the ones who might spend some time looking at those comments. A difference between performance goals and learning goals. And when things go badly, if I'm an entity theorist, because things have gone badly because I'm just not good at it and nothing will change that, then I should withdraw or avoid or maybe blame it on somebody else. If I'm an incremental theorist, then maybe when I fail at something, when I don't do well on something, that's a cue to say, hey, I need to either work harder or work differently at something. I need to change my strategy maybe. Now the thing is, if I believe that my ability at some academic task is pretty much fixed. Some people are just good at English and others aren't. Okay, if that's my focus, then when I don't do so well in English, what I should do is just avoid it as much as I can, because what's the use of putting in effort? It's not going to lead to anything. So, while there are individual differences in some levels of ability on things, for sure, we don't usually come up against the fact that people are working up against their very optimal level within their range. And so it's possible to make some big changes if students can come to be thinking more along the incremental theory line of things. So Dweck has actually demonstrated that teaching students some of these differences can lead to some different performances in academically related tasks. So challenging the idea that ability is fixed. So I think it's possible for us to imagine the importance of reflecting upon some of our own expectations and talking with our colleagues about that. Thinking about our own expectations for what should be happening for students in and outside of classroom, having conversation about that. Maybe educating students about the difference that effort can make. I mean, that's not going to answer everything, but it can have a bit of an impact, it seems. It can be useful to become familiar with some of the key literature in the scholarship of teaching and learning around things like student engagement inside and outside of class, so that we can then reflect upon how that links with our own practice and sometimes make some modifications in that practice and sometimes share the lessons of that reflection with others. And we might consider reflecting on the institutional culture and the kinds of modifications that can be made, the kinds of lessons that can be learned if we want to make a shift in this regard as well. So if we want to really focus on student learning, part of what we need to be thinking about, I think, is effort and time. Again, it's not the whole thing at all. I'm not saying it's the most important thing. But student effort and time is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for learning to take place. And the data suggests that there isn't a lot of time being spent, and maybe we want to reflect upon that. So we have a grand total of about 4 minutes left. We will not go beyond 4 o'clock, but I promise we won't do that, okay? But some different points of view, or some, there may have been something that I said that said, oh, that doesn't make any sense, or disagreements, or other comments that people might want to make.
When I compare the public school system and private schools in the primary and secondary schools, I think that that's where it starts, where it would have it start. And private schools in the United States, the high schools, have about 95% of their population will go on and graduate from a 4-year institution. And the public schools, that is not happening.
Right.
And, the kids, they're forbidden to bring home homework.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that reflects here as well. I might not be completely accurate in that assessment, but I'd say there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
So if they're coming to us after 12 years of that, we have our work cut out for us.
Okay. Here's one good piece of news on that, though. One of the difficulties that we have in teaching and also behavior change is difficulty in transferring behavior from one situation to another. That can help us sometimes too, okay? So we can make a fresh start in university, even with students who don't have very good study habits. In fact, I'm not sure what the UPEI data show on this, but I've seen other data with NSSE, I think, that suggests that students coming in expect that they're going to have to work harder than they actually report that they have to do. Okay, so the expectation, there's a mismatch even in that expectation. I don't know, do you know if that's true with UPI data or not? Yeah.
I know this with the BASI data that's just being
Yes,
analyzed.
I was going to comment that it's very interesting that you mentioned we need to educate our students about the differences that effort can make. We did a BASI survey, which is the beginning university student engagement survey, asking their high school study habit and engagement levels. And our data shows that many of them in high school senior year do not study hard at all. They do not spend a lot of time on study, and many of them do expect to spend a little bit more time to study when they are here. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, majority of them expect to earn a better grade than they did in high school.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And they didn't know that usually in higher learning, they should expect a lower grade instead of a higher grade, because our data shows usually we see about a 10-point drop from their high school average to their university average. Mm-hmm. So there's educating work to be done there.
Okay. 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 Thank you. Shannon.
I'm just wondering whether the statistics about the time students are spending studying going down go along with the time students are spending in work outside of university. That is the amount of time they have to spend their second and sometimes third jobs.
Right.
I wonder if this, do you know about any correlation?
There are increases in time spent in paid employment outside of university, but it seems that the biggest jumps are in time, not in employment, but in recreational kinds of activities and that kind of stuff. Okay, so we have, even when we look at students who aren't employed outside of university, we're not seeing big amounts of study time. So I think paid employment is an issue, and student debt is an issue for sure, but it's not accounting for a huge part of the variance, I think. Okay, it is just about, half a minute to 4 o'clock. So a couple of things, if you would like to have a look at any of the material on the slides, we'll just leave the handouts up here. And thank you very much for coming out today. Appreciate that.